due to the outbreak of the pandemic, as you know, we were compelled to cancel it. But I did not want to give up. We wanted to give a signal that we can manage to carry out our activities despite the difficulties. So I proposed the speakers to move the event online, and I'm so glad to see so many registered participants today. Obviously, we could not ignore what's going on right now. So we propose to shift the focus a bit and discuss the effects of COVID on global climate policies, on international cooperation, which is particularly in ETS, the topic of the Life Digital project that we are currently running at FSR Climate. To discuss this topic, which appears particularly relevant as we enter phase 2, today we have here, or better virtually here, 4 speakers from all over the world. In alphabetical order, Christian Gaulier, who's the director of the Toulouse School of Economics and president of IAIRI. Hi, Christian. Phoebe Koundouri, who's the president-elect of IAIRI and professor at the Athens University of Economics and Business, among other things. Hi, Phoebe. Esvaran Somanathan, who's professor at the Economics and Planning Unit of the Indian Statistical Institute in Delhi and program director of the Center for Research on the Economics of Climate, Food, Energy, and Environment. Hi, Sam. And Harald Winkler, who is professor at the University of Cape Town and member of the Academy of Science of South Africa. Hi, Harald. On top of that, last but not least, you see connected Jos de Becke, who's the chair of the Policy Outreach Committee, part-time professor at EOI and former Director General of DG Climate at the European Commission. So we prepare a set of interesting questions for our speakers. And so let's enter phase 2, let's say, of the event. I pass the ball to Jos, who will describe the format and start proposing the questions to our speakers.
Well, thank you, Simone, and good morning to all of you and to the many participants following today. As you outlined, Simone, the pandemic has a great impact in Europe and beyond. And so I'm particularly pleased that Harold and Som can join us today. We were planned to be in a seminar in Leuven and then in Florence today, as you outlined. So I'm particularly pleased they can join, because there is a raging debate in Europe about the Green Deal that has been put forward by the European institutions and the one that we have to follow for the 5 years to come. And now comes the pandemic with tremendous economic consequences and a stimulus package that we are going to see. It will also have an impact on our international cooperation for sure. So let's try to exchange some ideas about what we can expect. And I would like to open up with our international guests. And I would like to give the floor first to Som, and then to Harold, then to Phoebe, and then to Christian, to see what their opening ideas are for the debate we are currently going to have. And at the end, we definitely hope to have 15 minutes of questions and answers, and on reacting on the questions that you may advance to us. So starting without much further ado, Som, we are very grateful to have you today. The pandemic continues to spread all over the globe. With dramatic, of course, health consequences, social consequences, and we can foresee economic consequences. Seen from your place in the world, what do you expect? How do you look at the pandemic? And in particular, when it comes to the green agenda and the climate change agenda. Eager to have your thoughts. So.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Simone. It's a privilege to be in such good company. So I think that it's obvious to everybody that the pandemic is going to have a huge impact, not only in terms of health and social consequences, but on economies. So we're going to see what's clearly going to be a major recession, maybe more properly even a depression. That's going to be global. But I think it's also important to recognize that the consequences of this when we start to come out of the pandemic, maybe in a couple of years from now, when we have a vaccine and the pandemic itself is under control, but the economies will still be struggling because of the economic impacts. And things are going to be differential between, I think, the industrialized countries and lower and middle income countries in particular. And the main difference is that typically low income countries have much less fiscal space. So the interest rates at which the governments can borrow are going to be higher, and they're going to bump up against borrowing constraints much, much sooner than developed countries are. And you can see that already in terms of the size of the fiscal stimuli that you're seeing in different countries. So for example, in the US, they've already had a fiscal stimulus package passed of 10% of GDP. In India, that has been less than 1% of GDP so far. So you can see that there's a huge difference in the fiscal responses. And that's going to have economic consequences, and that's going to have consequences for the climate policy. And I think that in terms of climate policy, the way this is going to play out is that when these countries start coming out, when we all start coming out of the COVID, of the epidemic itself, and it's time to start rebuilding economies, then we're going to see fiscal stresses in lower and middle income countries. And that's going to mean that these countries are going to look around for revenue sources, and they're going to look around to cut subsidies, right? And I think that on the whole is good news for the climate. It could have been bad news, but I think it's going to turn out to be good news. And the reason it's going to turn out to be good news is that in most of these countries, basically cleaner alternatives are typically cheaper, at least as far as power generation is concerned, which is of course a very important sector. That's not yet true in the transport sector, for example, and it's not true in other sectors. But at least as far as these sectors are concerned, renewables are the cheaper option in most places. Can I ask for that slide to be shown? Kiara? Maybe I can, yeah. Yeah, that's the one. So basically, this is a recent graphic from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And what it shows is the cheapest source of new bulk electricity generation by country. And what you can see is the blue is wind and the yellow is solar. So you can see that most of the countries that Bloomberg studied, you can see that it's the renewable alternatives are cheaper than the fossil alternatives. And in an environment in which countries are under fiscal stress, they are typically not going to want to continue to subsidize more expensive alternatives. They're going to look for cheaper ways out, and that is going to be good news because you're going to see, I think, as a consequence, reduced support to fossil fuels. Now, that's not uniformly true. As you can see in parts of Southeast Asia and East Asia, you can see that coal is still the cheapest alternative. In Russia and Mexico, gas is the cheapest alternative, and so on. So it's not entirely true, but it's still true in very large parts of the world that account for very large parts of emissions and where there's going to be a lot of growth. So I think that's good news. Now, when it comes to other technologies and other sectors, things are not so rosy, right? So I think it's going to be true, for example, that you're going to need a lot more storage pretty soon in order for these renewables to be integrated, and you're going to need much cheaper storage in order to electrify transport to a large degree. And there, I think policy is going to make a very big difference because the developed countries are not going to be under the same kind of fiscal stresses than that the lower and middle income countries are. They're going to have these large stimuli for the next 2-3 years, maybe. And then the way they spend that money is going to be really important. If they push these new technologies and push them further down the learning curve, then it's going to have massive spillover effects in India and China and Asia and Latin America. But if they don't do that, then we're going to get set back a lot. So right now, basically, all movement down the learning curve for these new technologies is going to be on hold, essentially because of the economic crisis. So new investments are all slowed down. So we're not going to see that happen of its own accord. It could, however, get a policy-induced push. So what the countries that do have fiscal space right now can do and can make a very big difference globally and not just in their own countries and their own regions is push these new technologies like storage technologies further down the learning curve. And similar things can be said about sectors like buildings, industry, steel, and so on, where really new innovation is needed in order to make cleaner technologies more economically viable in countries which simply don't have the fiscal space to support them. Of course, it's possible that these other countries could raise revenue from taxing fossil fuels, and I think more of that is going to happen. In fact, we have already seen it in my country, in India, right? There's been a huge decline in the price of crude oil, but the price of gasoline and diesel in India has not fallen. And the reason it hasn't fallen is because the government has raised excise taxes on the fuels because its revenue is just collapsing with the economic crisis. So we can see, hopefully, more of that in the future. With regard to deliberate policy, with regard to pushing the climate agenda, I think at the moment, certainly in lower and middle income countries, this is taking a back seat. Because of the immediacy of the crisis. Now, that could change a little bit a couple of years down the road, but I suspect that still what's going to happen is because instead of the pandemic being the foremost crisis, we will have an economic crisis instead. And again, policymakers' attention is going to be basically devoted to how they're going to get their budgets back in order. So I'm not very optimistic that we're going to see an aggressive policy agenda from the developing countries, which is really unfortunate because those policies really make a very big difference. If you look at the difference between India and Pakistan, which are neighbors, which have basically the same climate, right? You'll see that Pakistan has almost no solar installed, and India is generating about 10% of its electricity from solar and wind, right? The reason for that is because India adopted a policy about 10 years ago, essentially in which the government would procure renewables through auctions. And that helped to create this ancillary supply chain. Of course, the inputs came mostly from China, the panels, but there are a lot of ancillaries and other things. That supply chain has to be created. That makes a very big difference. And that has happened in some countries and not in others because of policy. And unfortunately, going forward, I'm not sure that these poorer countries will really rise to the top of the policy agenda. I hope so, but I don't know.
Very good. Well, thank you, Som. If I can jump in, I think we have a bit of good news and less good news, but I think what is happening in the energy sector, and if I got you right, the energy sector is driven very much by market forces, and the price, the cost of renewables, in particular PV, is going down incredibly. Now, I saw on the graph that for South Africa, we also see the prices dropping for PV. So Harold, what's your take, building on the very useful comments that Som was making, that we have on the one hand, the power sector and the market playing a big role for policies, and they still have to be developed. And so we were recently in your country, we had useful discussions. So Harold, do you see similar tendencies compared to what Som was very helpfully indicating to us? Can you unmute? You have to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
yes.
We hear you, yes.
Thanks, Simon and Joss. Great, and I'll follow on directly quite a lot of similarities with, though we didn't coordinate some, the broad message I think is similar, but I am going to share some slides. Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's just introduction, so let me move off straight away. So I think that from the perspective sitting here in Cape Town in South Africa, that actually there's a confluence of three crises that we have now. We've been talking about the development and poverty and inequality are a crisis, and chronic ongoing crisis. Climate is a crisis and an emergency, and now we have the corona crisis. And I want to talk about debt and debt relief and just transition. Those are the topics. In response to the question that you sent very helpfully, thank you, Simon, of what economic and climate policy packages will be needed to deal with the economic consequences of COVID-19. And I'm putting up here a graph from Branko Milanovic. It's one of his older ones. There are more recent ones. You may have seen his more recent elephant graph, but he takes UN data and really shows that while the world is no longer divided into two groups of countries, the developed and developing, we are not living in a homogeneous world. Inequality is very much with us. And the really striking thing that was true, sorry to talk about India some, but at the time this was striking because the US and India are on this graph. Rather than any, it also is a good graph because it avoids any European countries, but you can imagine where they would be. But it basically shows this is populations divided into ventiles. We're used to deciles. These are just groups of, dividing into 20 groups, 5% each. And you can see that the very start of the US line is at about the same level as the very top of the Indian line, which means, as the words say there, that the poorest 5% of Americans had the same income in 2012 as the richest 5% of Indians. Now, if you slice that up into 1%, the same won't apply, but still, the basic point here is that we are still living in a world of high inequality, and that means that the economic consequences, as Som said, will be different. So next, I wanted to move on to one part of the debt, and this is, I saw a very interesting input, I thought, from Ricardo Hausmann. He was, I think, a vice minister in Venezuela, now at the Harvard School in the States. And he talked about the macroeconomic impact on many developing countries. I say many, I'm not sure it will be the same for China, but I think in many developing countries, those developing countries that don't have fiscal space, the same point that Som was making. And essentially, we've seen fiscal space evaporate. Absolutely true in South Africa. The country was so-called junk status rated by all of the rating agencies except Moody's, and shortly after our national shutdown started, they also rated us below investment grade. And what this graph that Hausmann shows that there's a lot of focus on flattening the curve of the epidemic, but it also makes it means that the impact is shorter and sharper, but flattening means it's longer. And so the red lines, if you see the red line, which is basically without containment measures, the economic impact then follows that kind of path. And so we really need policies, containment policies, both on the socioeconomic side and on the health side. And you used the term, and I've heard it a lot, Joss, of the green recovery or the green stimulus. Well, my basic metaphor is must be red and green. I'm not sure how popular red is in Europe. Depends perhaps which country you're in and who's in.
Harold, sorry to interrupt. Would you mind to enlarge your slides, so putting them in presentation?
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Our audience is asking.
Thank you, Chiara. Thank you, Chiara. I am not very skilled at this, but is that better?
No, it's smaller.
It's smaller. Okay.
It's a third icon you see at the very bottom. So where you are now, two more icons. Yes, this one.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, the presentation style I should know. Thank you, Chiara.
No problem.
And apologies to those attending if you couldn't see. Is that
better? And you should click. You should eliminate the comments, so we see also the comment section.
Oh, I don't mind if you see the comments, but
but the graph should be big, as big as possible. I think that was the question.
Okay.
Huh? Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's the question. Okay. So sorry, do I then need to...
You can either zoom more into that part of the presentation or get rid of the comments, probably by clicking on the comments icon below.
Okay, apologies for the technical confusion.
No problem.
I know how to do this better. in this view. So I think there's a slider down here somewhere which will allow me to make it bigger, right? And I can perhaps eliminate. Okay, sorry. Let me go on to the next one, and these slides will be available if people want to examine them afterwards. Sorry. Okay. So let me also. No, it's not. Okay. So these are some graphs just showing on. So the South African COVID recovery package, and note it's not called a stimulus package. We're basically rescuing the economy at this point and thinking about recovering after that. But there's an amount of 500 billion euro that's been announced and are used. Assume an exchange rate. Exchange rates are very volatile, another issue. But that would come to about 25 billion euros. And that's broken down. My point about the spending, the detail doesn't matter, but I've colored it in red because basically all the spending is red. It's on social, on health, on social, if it's not health, it's on health, and then it's on social grants and basically wage support, tax deferments, and so on. In terms of the funding sources, so just a specific example of what Sam talked about. Some of this will come from domestic reprioritization, taking the National Treasury's budget and saying, let's reprioritize and look at what's already in there. But the 200 billion South African rand and the 95 billion would basically be borrowed. And that is part of the story that our fiscal space has evaporated, because even if the IMF loans are at 1%, they have to be repaid. And so that's critical. And then to move on to my last slide, you'll be happy to hear, Joss, I'm starting to wrap up. And linking it back to climate particularly. So I think the challenge in South Africa, as I see it, and what I will be advocating for, is to somewhat green this very red agenda, right? That's where we are at. And one of the ways in which I think this can happen is something that has been very actively developed called a just transition transaction. And the question in relation to that is, how can international climate finance accelerate the phase out of coal for electricity? And this is important. Some also spoke to, so this is not money going into new coal, it's going into the opposite. It's actually taking out coal, and the two lines that you see there from some of my colleagues at UCT who've done some modeling would be already in our electricity plan. There is a decommissioning of coal-fired power because solar and solar PV and wind are cheaper in South Africa. The renewables are least cost. So even in the reference case that declines, but you accelerate even. So what is the investment in the premature retirement of capital, if you want? And it's shown here in terawatt hours, but it's very easy to convert this into tons. And the deal would basically be for development finance institutions to fund, and President Ramaphosa put forward a number of $11 billion that would basically reduce a large amount of emissions. This is not where traditional use of international climate finance into renewables and efficiency and cleaner things, but actually phasing out the coal, which of course makes space for the cleaner energy sources. But what is important here is also then again that this is now happening. This will help our national utility, which is already has an existing debt of last count 450 billion rand, another 25 billion euros. But in addition, now we will be borrowing another 20 billion euros, and so the debt relief for countries, debt and debt relief, I think, will be an important topic. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harold. And I'm very pleased to note, the similarities between what Sam was telling us, what you are telling us. Good time for renewables, reduced fiscal space. That is a common problem. And the particular suggestion that you just made to use climate finance for the phase out of coal, in the context of just transition. I think it's a very important and appealing comment, but I'm not sure that all climate enthusiasts in the United Nations are going to welcome giving money directly or indirectly to coal. But let's park that for the discussion. Fibe, let's turn to Europe. We have a Green Deal discussion that is being reconfirmed by the President, Ursula von der Leyen, and by the Vice President, Frans Timmermans. So what is your take, Phoebe, on fighting COVID-19 and pushing through the Green Deal in Europe?
Thank you, Jos. Thank you, Simon. I will give my view on the current health crisis in the energy market in particular, and try to connect this with the efforts to implement the European Green Deal. Obviously, the pandemic has shown that governments are able to take drastic measures, that people are able to adapt their behavior, that governments seem to be better equipped for swift responses to major crises as opposed to international institutes, and that the timing of taking the measures is really important. With regards to the energy sector, this current crisis is having a major impact across this sector and threatens to undermine efforts to accelerate clean energy transition. And the question is, how can this energy transition help kickstart the economies? And my response to this is that we need to set ambitious agendas for the creation of jobs and climate goals. We need the leadership of the public sector in investing in clean energy. 70% of the current sector is directly or indirectly driven by the public, by government. So we need the leadership, the public leadership here. And we also need to make energy efficiency, renewables, and battery storage central to economic recovery. We know, as it has been already noted by by the other panelists, by our colleagues, that flattening the infection curve obviously steepens the macroeconomic recession. At this point, I want to point to 5 major priorities in order to avoid turning this pandemic into a major economic and financial crisis. First, keep the workforce in place, employed, even if they don't go to their job. Governments should channel financial support to the public and private institutions. SMEs should be safeguarded against bankruptcy. Policies to support the financial system should be implemented, should be launched, as we all know that non-performing loans will mount, and fiscal packages will have to be financed by national debt. National debt is a big issue. We are heading towards a new debt crisis, and of course it needs handling. We haven't proved that we are good in handling debt crisis, but the other major issue is how to make this recovery, these new packages that will restart our economy sustainable. It is important to make it sustainable, because if we don't, then we are going to be facing additional crises in the future, and we've all seen how big the cost of these crises are. The international agency advised us to think big and invest on what we have, and I agree. The clean energy investment push that we need needs to be huge, because the current crisis, the economic crisis, is huge. Policies with existing and legal institutional structure are easiest to scale up, so we should start there. Wind and solar are cost competitive. I agree with the previous speakers, but we need to support the policy framework in order to allow them accelerate and be major pillars for the post-pandemic stimulus effort. And I would be pointing to lithium-ion batteries and hydrogen electrolyzers that have the potential to be the coming decades breakout technologies. How can we integrate the current situation with the oil prices? Well, the oil market is collapsing. We know demand is collapsing. Supply is overabundant. Bankruptcies in these sectors are likely to cause global financial instability. But let us think more closely. Generally, these low oil prices may have green energy less competitive, but at the same time, oil exporters might see these very low negative prices as an incentive to invest to somewhere else, to renewables. And if they do, for example, if Saudi Arabia invest in renewables, then investors could then interpret this move as a sign that oil margins will be low, so they put more money, more capital into green resources. Now, with regards to EU carbon markets, well, we had a 25 euro per ton price, which was an okay price, not the optimal price, but help us drive the goal to phase out. After the pandemic, this price collapsed, and at the moment, we are facing a serious issue there. We can use the market stability reserve of ETS because it's been there to absorb excess allowances. And it is the main reason for the 25 euro price. I will continue to take out the surplus and cancel those permits later. But this mechanism was designed to handle past oversupply accumulated and is not fit for the purpose to deal with current or future surpluses. So I suggest that SR needs to be strengthened and refined, and I can discuss later in what ways. Now, with regards to how we deal with the pandemic, I think it's quite important to learn from the financial crisis of the 2008, because back then, yes, we had a drop that lasted for a year, and then we've seen a major upswing, the biggest in history. And some colleagues from LSE and Oxford has studied 196 stimulus fiscal recovery policies that have been implemented in response to the financial crisis in 2008, and only 63 of them were green. At the same time, we find, based on our experience of from the recovery of the financial crisis, that green stimulus policies have advantages over traditional fiscal stimulus because they deliver higher multiples due to reduced long-term energy costs and flow-on effects to the wider economy. And in a latest survey in 2022, just last month, 231 officials from ministries of finance, central banks, other economies have been interviewed in order to ascertain their perspectives on the current health crisis and the way the fiscal recovery packages should be. And the assessment based on this survey is that there seems to be a consensus that climate positive policies offer superior economic characteristics. So the guidelines to the regulators: invest in energy answers, build efficiency spending for renovations and retrofits, invest in education and training to address unemployment from COVID and structural shifts for decarbonization, invest in natural capital, invest in clean research and development, and for the less low-income countries, rural support scheme spending for sustainable agriculture, ecosystem regeneration, and accelerating clean energy installations. I want to close what I am presenting today with a comparison between the response to COVID and climate change. Climate change has the potential to end up killing more people than the COVID crisis, but the death rate is referenced as increased frequency and severity of natural disasters and is spread over decades. The IPCC report has warned against new viruses, and increasing temperatures will give rise to epidemics. So why are we not responding to climate change? Effective policies against climate change obviously require international cooperation. COVID does not at first stage. Then on the other hand, climate change policies are not so disruptive as lockdowns. So what should be I'm wrapping up. What should be our response? Attempting to face each new crisis with the same thinking that gave rise to the crisis itself will not give us a pathway that will be sustainable. What is needed is a fundamental transformation of economic, social, and financial systems that will trigger exponential change in strengthening social, economic, health, and environmental resilience. We need big thinking, we need big changes, we need systems innovation, and the good news is that we have our blueprints. It's the UN Agenda 2030 with the 17 SDGs and the European Commission Green Deal. So we are facing a time that the economic crisis will be more severe than the 2008 financial crisis. The decarbonization challenge is more urgent. However, energy technologies are more mature and ready to scale up. So I say it's a good time to embrace the EU taxonomy out in late 2019 for sustainable investment, phase out fossil fuels, eliminate fossil subsidies, invest in circular and low carbon economies, shift from industrial to regenerative agriculture, exploits the limits of the digital revolution, and while you're doing so, leave no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Phoebe. And I see some similarities with what we heard from Som and from Harold. That is a big emphasis on policy, quite some hope when it comes to the energy sector, in particular the renewables. But still, the fiscal space. I think you know the maneuvering around in a looming debt crisis, which you also were indicating, Phoebe. I'm sure Didier, sure Christian has a lot to add to these messages. Christian, you follow the French debate in particular, and also there is an emerging debate about what to do in Europe. Can you shed some light? You know.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ross. I will try to be short because of we are running out of time. Yeah, in Europe, as in many other places, the pandemic is the catastrophic economic consequences. And there is a risk that it's only the beginning. If we look at the rate of immunization in the population, it's relatively far away from herd immunity. And so there is this big risk of a second wave. I'm working myself on the pandemic dynamic modelings, SIR and those things. And what I see in those pandemic dynamics modeling, and when I compare that to what I see in the media, I see a big difference. I see, I mean, epidemiologists expect the pandemic to stay there for a long time, with risk of second or third wave, as for the Spanish influenza last century. And so I'm sorry to be relatively pessimistic about the economic consequence of the pandemic. It's good we have seen in Europe, and that's particularly the case in this continent, state as an insurer of last resort. It's excellent. We still have many difficulties with people not being covered by this public solidarity system, but it's probably working much better than in other regions in the world. The consequence of that is huge public indebtedness. Probably we will see public indebtedness increasing by 20–30% within the next 1 year or two. And the consequence of that in terms of climate change and fighting climate change, it will be, and it has been already been stated by previous panelists, subsidizing green growth was already difficult in the past. It will be even more difficult to that in the future. It's true that subsidizing brown technology will also become more difficult, which is the good part of it. But let us concentrate on green growth. Green growth, we will have to think about finding other money than public money to finance it. That's, I think, one of the big consequences of the COVID on climate change. Don't shoot at the ambulance. I see many people suggesting that the world after will not be similar to the world before, because we will make all those changes at the same time we try to cure the economy from the pandemic. Yeah, I think it will be difficult. It's a dream. It would be nice to realize it, but I think priorities will not be in the short run to switch the economy to greener growth. Asking households to pay more for their electricity or for their transportation was already hard before. And talking from France with the yellow vest, I know what that means. It will be even more difficult in the next few months, given the fact that we are so many people suffering, not only people, households and corporations suffering from the crisis. So in the short run, don't shoot at the ambulance. Please let us start curing the pandemic. We have one instrument. With that objective of saving the economy, which is unconditional transfer to vulnerable economic agents, corporation, and I think in particular, for example, about the airline companies. We need. I think it's important to save that industry as the others. It's not only because I live in Toulouse, and maybe Toulouse will become next Detroit if we don't fly anymore in the future. But I think in the short run, we need to save our employment and our industry, making sure that the current temporary crisis, pandemic crisis, does not have a permanent consequence for the economy. And then we need to save the planet. And to save the planet, we should not condition the loans we will make to save the economy. We have another instrument to do that, which is carbon pricing. And here I disagree with previous panelists. I think that renewables are not yet the least cost way of producing electricity. When we take into account of the many technological disadvantage of those renewables, in particular the intermittency. And also keep in mind that the oil-rich countries have already reacted to our attempt to green our industry and economy by reducing by a vast amount the oil price on the international markets. And I believe that that will continue to be the case, because they need, that's their source of revenue, and they want to protect this source of revenue by maintaining oil price and more generally fossil fuels prices low. So we need carbon pricing. We definitely need carbon pricing, and that's a good way to get out of the crisis. We can at the same, because most of the green investments are incentivized not by current price and by current sacrifices, but by the expectation of future large price of carbon in the Union. So why not curing the economy of the current pandemic by doing those unconditional transfer, and at the same time reforming the carbon pricing market, the carbon pricing technique we have been using for 15 years in Europe. The problem is, as we see with the pandemic today, and that was already explained by Phoebe, for example, we have too much volatility, way too large uncertainty about what will be the carbon price in the Union for the next 30 years. And that's, and let me repeat that, that's really, those expectations is the driver of the current efforts to green the economy by the market players. And so the fact that we have so much uncertainty about the future carbon price, given the current mechanism of the EU ETS, is the key problem. And we need to cure that. So I propose with others, in particular my friends and colleague Jacques Delplat, I propose to reform the carbon pricing methodology in Europe by forgetting about quantitative objectives, but rather having pricing objectives. So let us move to a market for permit, to a market where the price is controlled by a specific player. Let me call that the central bank for carbon, which would get the democratic mandate from the union to control the evolution of the price, make commitment about the evolution of the price of carbon for the next 30 years, and selling and purchasing carbon permits to the market player in the European Union. That would be, because we have seen that politicians are short-termism for many different reasons. The credibility issue of the future of carbon pricing is the key issue. We know how to solve political credibility questions in the Union. We created the European Central Bank to make it credible that politicians want to fight inflation. Why not trying to do the same thing for carbon pricing? Why not providing creating an independent institution in charge of controlling the evolution of the carbon price in a credible way? So reducing uncertainty and making things more credible is crucial. That does not mean that we don't need public investment to help greening the economy. As we will increase the carbon price in the next few years in Europe, that will also imply consequences for investing public money in greener infrastructures. Of course, the price of carbon that will be implemented in the Union will have also consequence in the evaluation of green investments by the different nations of the Union. And the increasing price of the carbon implies that we will need more public money for those green investments in infrastructure. And so that's why I'm happy to see that in the Green New Deal, in the EU Green Deal, sorry, we also have a mechanism to help the national government to finance those green investments, assuming we will make the correct link between the carbon pricing and the green investment by using the carbon price we have from that one world of carbon pricing to make the evaluation of which green investments are compatible with common good. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christian. And I note that you are somewhat less optimistic about the prospects for public policy, hence your emphasis on the carbon market and the carbon price. And I think that's duly noted. And there were some questions that I noted related to the carbon price and the volatility that you were indicating and others were indicating. And there were lots of questions on the market stability reserve. Will it function? But you raise another additional element, I think, which is the long-term perspective, which is the Green Deal, 2050, climate neutrality. So the essence of the point you are making is about uncertainty. You know, are our politicians going to be believed to push the system towards carbon neutrality? You know, that is basically the point you're making. Christian.
Yeah, democracy is the dictatorship of the short term. And we have seen that with the 2008 crisis, the Euro crisis. We have seen that right now in a lesser extent with the pandemic crisis. The volatility of the carbon price on the EU ETS is a problem, and also the level. I mean, the fact that the level of the carbon price is so far away in Europe compared to the political objective of a reduction by 30 or 40% of emissions by the year 2030 and zero net emission by the year 2050. We have two big problems, not only volatility, but also level. And that's the consequence of the fact that, you know, politicians in a world where people believe in a happy transition, we're creating millions of jobs, reducing electric invoices for the household. It's extremely difficult. So we need to transfer this authority through of carbon pricing to a democratic mandate transfer to an independent agency in charge of making sure that Europe will fulfill its political commitment to decarbonize the economy in the next 30 years.
But you are making 2 points, which is volatility and the level of the price. I think the volatility is the question of the market stability reserve. I think that the volatility has been mild, and I compare it, as Phoebe was doing, to the crisis of 2008. The volatility was well controlled so far. We don't know what is going to come. On the other hand, the price level, that's the point you are making, that we should have higher carbon prices. And then comes the question of the international competitiveness that our economies are going to suffer. And then I would like to question and play the question to Harold and to some in particular, because if we say higher carbon prices in Europe, there is going to be more pressure on the competitiveness, and the debate on the border measures is going to come squarely on the table of the policymakers. Now, Sam and Harold, you are part of those observing what is happening in Europe on the Green Deal, and in particular on these pricing measures that may be translated to border measures. What would be your reaction to it? I see it coming up in several questions, and I think that that is something that is uniting us, because a border measures in Europe means that you know, your experts are going to be directed in one way or the other. Shall we start with Sam?
Yes, yeah, it's a bit hard to say how that will pan out. I mean, it's not clear that, I mean, of course, energy intensive exports to Europe will be impacted. But, you know, I'm not sure that that's going to make a very big difference to, you know, to overall trade, because I suspect that the fraction of exports from India and China to Europe, for example, or Southeast Asia for that matter, that are energy intensive enough to be impacted by, you know, by a border price will not be all that big. And secondly, the border price, you know, the border price adjustment itself will not make such a big price difference, because you're only going to be imposing that on the fraction of the value that embodies the energy. And then on top of that, you have a carbon price, which isn't all that high in Europe to begin with. So I don't think it will make a very big difference. I wouldn't really worry about it. I just wanted to respond to one thing Christian said. I mean, I think that we are not really very much in disagreement. I mean, I do think that, you know, carbon pricing is very important. I just think that the political prospects for carbon pricing in the lower and middle income countries is very small. And so it's very important for the richer countries to have spillover effects on the prices of substitutes, renewables, storage, etc., to help those countries along. But I do think there will be some effects. Like I said, I think the fiscal crisis will mean that lower and middle income countries that are giving large subsidies, which tend to go to the incumbents, which are the fossil fuels, I think those will be cut. So in fact, in some ways, things are going to look better.
Thank you very much, Sam. Harold, if I switch to you from a South African perspective, are you equally mild in your perspective to what Europe may plan as the next step in carbon pricing? Can you unmute yourself? Yeah.
No, Joss, as you're kind of guessing, I'm not quite as mild. So I mean, I take a bit of a step back. I think overall, I think it was Yuval Harari who wrote that really this Corona crisis faces us with a big choice of, do we choose global solidarity or do we all retreat into economic nationalism? And I would see a unilaterally imposed border carbon adjustment as definitely a retreat into the latter. There's been very bad history with that. And I think it also raises the bigger question that we're seeing anyway, and you would know probably better than I do, Joss. Do we want to conduct climate policy through trade negotiations? Do you want to do climate change in the WTO? Because if Europe decides to, impose this unilaterally, I know there are no longer 28 but 27 member states, but from the outside that would be seen as unilateral and has in the past been seen as such. I mean, in terms of what's happening in South Africa, we do have a carbon tax that's underpinned by legislation. We are, in terms of pricing carbon, we are many years behind Europe. We did not choose a trading scheme, but what's happening right now is that payments to companies have been deferred for 3 months. One of the ways in which relief has been given to some companies. In the South African debate, I'll be arguing that should not become a precedent, right? We must keep a carbon price absolutely in South Africa. But I think this is something that needs to be, carbon pricing needs to continue to be negotiated multilaterally. That would be my perspective.
Thanks, Harold. I think Phoebe and Simone may also have thoughts on this. Phoebe, Christian, yeah, go ahead.
Very quickly, I just wanted to point out that carbon pricing is not our only green instrument and stimulus, and carbon income is just 25 billion, whereas the whole budget from the European Green Deal is estimated to 1 trillion. I agree with Christian in that he's saying that uncertainty is a central issue. And one of the main uncertainties that have been recently dealt with is the uncertainty of what is green and what is not green. What's a green investment and what is not a green investment? And this is the EU taxonomy. So based on the hope that this EU taxonomy will be integrated and will be embraced, not just by the European Investment Bank, but also by the European Central Bank and all the national banks and the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, I see a lot of hope here, because it's not just emissions. It's turning our economy resilient, understanding the interconnection between pollution, biodiversity loss, and sustaining the resilience of the whole ecosystem services. So it is crucial and important. And given that there is a scientific speculation that this pandemic is a result of the loss of biodiversity because it brought together wild animals with humans, it is quite important to understand that resilience and sustainability is something that needs understanding of the integration of ecosystem services and the interaction of these services with humans. So EU taxonomy for me is crucial and central as a driving force, much more than the ETS. And it's a good suggestion what Christian said before. I agree. We might need to regulate this in an out of 4-year democracy spell, election spell. So that's something to work on further, I think. Thank you.
Well, thanks. I think, Phoebe, underlining that European policy is not only carbon policy. I think that is sometimes a narrow down that has been made too easily. And the EU taxonomy, I think, is a very, very important tool. Before I close, because we come to the end of our discussion and I'm going to hand over for some concluding comments to Simone, I cannot resist making a further remark to Christian, and that is that having been in policymaking for quite some time myself, I think policymaking on a price is so open and so blunt, so to speak, because a higher carbon price means a radical attack on coal and a radical stimulus on nuclear, and renewables. And I think with those three elements, you can summarize in Europe what a higher carbon price will bring as a debate and as a political debate. And in the institutions that we are currently having, we need a qualified majority, at least to, I think if we move to prices, we would have to move to unanimity decision making, which would make it impossible between 27 member states. You know, I think that there is some history why we did what we did, and I appreciate your comments, but I cannot resist making the comment that, you know, a price level to be agreed amongst 27 member states is going to be quite a heroic decision-making process. Yeah, go ahead, Christian.
A very quick reaction. We know that we can price carbon and at the same time transfer the burden of the costs associated to the transition that is generated by the price through using the income coming from the tax or the selling of the permits. We should negotiate with Poland and with the Eastlanders of Germany to compensate for the job lost from the coal mines. That should be part of the negotiation, and I think there is a road there to negotiate a higher price of carbon that will eliminate the coal from the electricity mix in Europe, which is the simplest thing to do when we think about the least cost strategy to reduce emissions in Europe, and we need to think about recognizing that France should compensate Poland and Germany for asking them to remove coal from their mix.
Thanks for that comment, because it comes down to that, you know, it's a transfer that is happening between member states inside Europe, let alone the international transfer that we were discussing with Sam and with Harold, you know, that puts the question in a quite challenging perspective, given that the fiscal space is going to be more limited. I think we all agree to that. I'm afraid an hour is always short. Yes, Phoebe, quickly, and then I hand over to Simone.
In 1 minute, the European Green Deal has this Just Transition Fund, which is exactly for that purpose.
Yeah, absolutely correct. And I think I would also add that lots of the instruments of the European Union, like cohesion policy and regional policy, have been tuned to facilitate this just transition, because the Just Transition Fund as itself, on itself, is going to be limited, at least in a first stretch, because of the limited fiscal space. You know, unfortunately, that is how things are panning out. I hate to say that we are coming to the end of our discussion, but I'm heartened to note the convergence amongst the economists. And I'm also realistic enough to see how the disputes amongst economists are always coming down to pricing, public regulation, and things like that. But I think we all recognize what needs to be done. I think that some, in particular, followed by Harold, everybody has some faith in the market prices for renewables and carbon and storage going down quickly. But there is also a common, strong need for more policy. And that will need to be elaborated. You know, we had the beginning of this debate. I hope that in Berlin, where our next meeting is going to be, we can perhaps more elaborate on what the next policy steps should be, because I think that policymakers are in need for more operational ideas. And I'm sure as a POC, the POC from the ERA, we have lots of things to contribute. Christian.
The meeting will not be in Berlin, it will be online. Okay, keep in mind that in June.
Okay. Yeah, indeed. Yeah, it will be online. My apologies. My mindset is not yet completely adapted to the new world. So handing over for concluding words to Simone. Thank you very much to Harold, to Sam, to Christian, to Phoebe. I found the insights very stimulating and not as dark as I sometimes reads when economists come up in facing up to the limited fiscal space. But Christian was putting a little bit of cold water over the optimism that here and there was available. Simone, for the concluding words.
It's unfair that I have to close, to be honest, because I was having a great time, and time flies when you're having a great time. Christian actually threw some bombs, and I could see the reactions from the audience with lots of interesting questions. And so I apologize with the attendees that I cannot pick up the questions more, because it would be really interesting. If it was for me, we could stay until dinner time, but unfortunately, my web team is strict. We have to close, but please stay tuned, because we will have more, and Joss already anticipated that we will have more also at the European Association of Environmental Resource Economists, virtually in Berlin, so to speak. So we will have other discussions there, and in the meantime, stay tuned with FSR activities, and most of all, stay safe. Thanks everybody for the participation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you, Joss.
Thank you.